lecture in economics and focuses on behavioral economics, environmental economics, and well-being, as well as cultural economics. And she's published very widely on that field, on, for example, environmental taxation, renewable energy adoption, but also cooperation and market failures. Marie, we're very happy to have you here. The topic of your talk today is well-being in the natural environment, insights from a paradise lost. And that said, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And hello, everybody. I'm assuming you can hear and see my slides. Great. So in my presentation today, I'm just going to share with you some of the questions that I'm grappling with and some of the areas that are creating quite a bit of excitement in my mind as to, potential for a future agenda on research in this field. I come from a background of policy. I spent about 20 years in environmental policy making, and then spent about 10 years in academia more recently. And so a lot of my work is really applied, and I like to take it straight to policy as much as possible. In fact, I note that there are people from the Environmental Agency with the from Malta in the audience today, so that's great to see you there. I'll tell you a little bit about the context where most of these studies are carried out, the Paradise Lost. So Malta is a Mediterranean island, very highly urbanized, by some accounts completely so, very highly densely populated, high motorization rate, like very high numbers of cars per capita, which is surprising considering how small the country is. Without traffic, you could practically drive from north to south in about an hour. It's a totally different story with traffic, of course. We've got all sorts of environmental challenges, water shortages. We're called the noisiest man of Europe because we also have high levels of noise pollution. We do have lovely bathing water, but in many other domains of the environment, there are substantial challenges. And this is the context where most of the studies and most of the questions that I'll be sharing with you are based. I want to say that I really enjoyed Mirko's talk, and he covered the methodological challenges. And in my talk, I'll be talking a little bit more about thematic areas. So sort of the kind of questions we could be asking on different themes on the sort of axis between well-being and the natural environment. Before I go on, though, I want to sort of go back to the bulk of my work, which is pro-environmental behavior. And I want to link that with well-being too, because as those of us who work in this domain know, theoretically, we often model or assume that pro-environmental behavior happens because there is some utility being driven from it. It may not be always related to the fulfillment of environmental preferences. It can be related to the fulfillment of pro-social preferences, for instance, or even political preferences, as I show in my own work. It can and often is related to levels of education, as was mentioned by Professor Oswald in the beginning. Also related to spirituality and religiosity, as I find in my own work, and so forth. In one of our studies, we found that people were getting so much back from giving that they were even willing to do it and pay for it. So willing to recycle, despite the fact that recycling was actually costing them more, not just in terms of time, but actually in terms of out-of-pocket costs. So this leads me, and also we're observing in some of our more recent work that moral pro-environmental motives, even among entrepreneurs, spill over even into the place of business, where the bottom line is, traditionally considered to be the be-all and end-all of business. Of course, we do consider that there is some, benefits to businesses going green, and we're aware of those. But now we're also observing that When entrepreneurs have green moral motivations, we are seeing that spill over even into the way that the business is run. So what does this tell us for well-being? Well, it tells us that there is some well-being, some utility, at least, being derived from pro-environmental behavior. It tells us that it's not just about being in nature or being in pollution that can be giving us, can be a subject of study on the axis between environmental well-being, but also giving to the environment. So the process of contributing to pro-environmental actions can be giving us well-being. And so in one of our studies, we actually created a composite index to measure, the relationship between environmental interaction and well-being, which didn't just include exposure or extent of going to the countryside, but also the extent to which the respondents were contributing to the environment. In terms of what this is for us, for implications for future work, I guess one thing could be that we could start to study the causal effects of pro-environmental behavior directly on well-being, whether that is greater with high environmental quality or greater in polluted contexts. We could also explore, to answer Professor Oswald's question in the beginning, sort of what could we be saying to people? Should we be guilting them into pro-environmental behavior? Should we be scaring them? Well, perhaps we could be also telling them that it would make them happy, or that there is, or at least that happy people tend to contribute more. Is there a potential for substitution? If you live in a polluted environment, could you get your environmental kick from contributing to the environment? So that's sort of my first area, which I'm thinking about at the moment. A second area is about the distinction between nature and green and the more mundane things of that neighborhoods are. So we did conduct, as part of a suite of studies related to hosting the European Capital of Culture, a study where we observed that the current situation in their locality, as observed by respondents, was linked to, again, a correlational study, simple regression, but we do have the data now to follow this up with panel. But we did observe that, depending on the current situation, there was a relationship between how respondents perceived the situation in their locality with their self-assessed life satisfaction. I'm having a bit of a problem with I'll stop sharing and I'll just show you the slides directly. Sometimes that happens. Just give me a moment. I'll share the screen again. Okay. Okay. We're taking this sort of local environment issue a little bit further with the analysis of EU SILC data. So this is the survey on income and living conditions, which the European Union conducts or has conducted, has countries conducting in all European Union member states and beyond, very large samples. And in 2018, the survey included well-being modules. And we're using that now to look at the effect of neighborhood noise. For people who are working on noise, I think this is a very, very exciting opportunity because it doesn't, the data set doesn't just show us neighborhood noise in a lot of countries, how it's perceived and possible relationships with well-being, but it also has a lot of data on the internal environments that people live in. So it's kind of this interface between inside and outside. However, I want to sort of share with you my thoughts on this idea of neighborhoods and mundane lives by showing you what came out of some qualitative research that we did. We conducted a study in Valletta asking people a very simple question: what makes you happy and what makes you unhappy? in your everyday lives, just really open-ended. And it was, we actually intercepted people on the streets and just had a conversation with them. We had children, we had old people, we had even people aged 93 and well, age 6 too. It's interesting what people told us when, you know, they weren't constrained with a questionnaire. They mentioned things like birds, the outdoors generally, gardening, sunshine. They also mentioned things like noise, insects, dirt, littering, and dog poop. Now, I'm going to pause a little bit on this dog poop issue because I want to say that how often have any of us seen a questionnaire which asks people whether, you know, their interaction on a daily basis with things like dog poop, right? We don't tend to, we tend to sort of eliminate certain environmental issues or things that we encounter in our environment when we're constructing these questionnaires. And yet when you ask people candidly, you know, they come up with this kind of thing. And in urban environments, these things seem to matter. In an online survey, similarly very open-ended, people again mentioned things like the sea, sunshine, beauty, and negative things like driving, traffic. We all know these determinants and they're well studied, but also barking, for example. So I guess what I want to say, and this point was made in the chat when during Mirko's presentation, there is no one single methodology, you know, and qualitative insights can give us a lot of avenues to study. Sensory issues, which are not necessarily environmental priorities in terms of the kind of targets we need to hit for, you know, international conventions or European Union regulations, but they seem to matter to people too. It's also interesting how when people speak to us, they kind of confound environmental quality with the weather. So going out to the countryside on a nice sunny day or going to the beach when, you know, when the weather is beautiful. So I'm, again, not quite sure sort of how much of environmental quality is jumbled up with it being a nice day. And I also want to say that and reiterate that as a potential avenue for future research, I think the EU Silk data set has a lot of potential. As I said, in 2018, they included a well-being module. With the kind of data that there is, once there is, we will have a panel of this because we have decided in Malta to start to include the well-being module annually. So there could also be a potential to look at how there's also a lot of data on whether people have moved recently, what made them move house and so forth. So this could start to speak to the question of sorting as well. Next item I want to talk to you about is the idea of the green versus the blue. So we're currently just embarking on a Horizon 2020 project called Ecoscope, where our task as the University of Malta is to explore the well-being effects of the sea, but a little bit more specifically, we're tasked to explore the well-being effects of ecosystems-based fisheries. I'm having a bit of problem with, just give me one moment. Here we go. Okay. Okay. Can you see the screen again now?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry about that. So within Ecoscope, our role is to examine well-being effects of well-managed fisheries. Now, it's hard enough to examine the well-being effects of the sea. It's still, you know, one of the sort of growing areas of research in the environmental domains. Still less to examine what well-managed fisheries will do and whether that will move the needle on well-being at all. However, the way we're thinking about it at the moment is to look at the effects on consumers, the effects on fishers, and the effects on coastal communities. And it's on the latter that there has been some work, the effects of being by the water, in the water, or on the water, the effect of exercise, the effect of socializing, the effects on temperature. There are two precursor Horizon 2020 projects that we know about. One is called Blue Health, and the other is called Seas, Oceans and Public Health in Europe. Coming to sort of an agenda for future research in this area, the questions that are exciting me are about the negative impacts of blue spaces. So we heard earlier about sort of exposure to extreme environments. However, being by the sea can also be not just positive for well-being, but also negative. The risk of flooding, the marine litter, migrants, and all the drama that goes on with migrant landings, the risk of sea level rise. So looking at the negative impacts is one of the items that I think could be, forthcoming on the agenda. In a recent systematic review on blue environments and well-being, the key gaps mentioned were the lack of studies that employ a causal methodology, and the prevalence of questionnaires which don't employ validated items. Other interesting areas in this field could be whether blue environments work for well-being with or without green environments. Sort of typically, as we heard earlier, in fact, that they're being by the sea is also related to being in an open space or being in nature, being able to see the sky, being able to be away from the urban. So it's quite a challenge for me in my mind at the moment, how we're going to identify these effects. A fifth theme, and I think I should tell you at this point that I only have 6 themes, so we're almost there, that I want to share with you, is related to the environment and well-being in ordinary as opposed to extraordinary times. So we conducted a study on the effects of COVID-19 on well-being in Malta. In this study, we also examined what happened to people's ability to go by the sea or nature. This was measured on a simple scale, and we also measured life satisfaction and happiness, very standard, typical happiness equations. We included exposure to COVID. We included a small personality scale. What we found was that prior to COVID, the ability to go by the sea or nature yielded a significant coefficient with a size which is very similar to other equations that we had done. During COVID, there was a significant decline in activity going in nature, also reflected by the fact that there was, government constraints and public health announcements to stay in as much as possible. In fact, as you can see in this bar chart here, going out to nature was declined among 53% of the sample. So for over half the sample, there was a significant decline in their ability to go out to nature. When we ran a panel with this data, we found that there was, quite a large effect of nature on both life satisfaction and well-being. But that's not the interesting part. What's interesting is that this sort of reveals yet another unintended cost of lockdown. We've seen the costs of lockdown documented in countries as far as China and Malta. We've seen the effects that lockdown has had on anything from stress to not being able to go to hospital, take medication and cure, curable illness. But now we can also examine the effect that lockdown has had on one's ability to enjoy outdoor environments. And what this could potentially see as future areas of research is to look at, the disparities when there is an environmental shock and who can adapt to that environmental shock. And of course, one of the key areas where this can be studied further is in terms of our ability to adapt to climate change. So we will observe more freak weather events, extreme heat in countries like Malta, and we know that the ability of the poor to adapt to such conditions is going to be harder. And so, this could be an area where if we want to address disparities and basically guide policy to make our worlds better, our countries better places to live in, this is an area that could be looked at.
Marie,
yes.
Are you already at the end? Because then we would have some time for more questions.
Yes.
The next 8 minutes.
I have one more slide left. Shall I share?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to keep popping out of the share facility, but this is what's happening. Okay, so I want to conclude also by sort of suggesting that we move from studying environment and well-being mainly in mainlands to start to consider the potential of other contexts such as islands. So islands in the global agenda are often arguing that they make a low contribution to environmental problems, but they have high exposures and high cost of environmental management. Malta is one such place. We're looking at this ourselves in what is called the Malta Wellbeing Index project, where we're looking at both objective and subjective indicators to guide policy. There are other initiatives like the Environmental Resources Authority is looking at well-being and environment. My suggestion or my provocation is to sort of move research beyond mainlands to start to look at diverse contexts, to examine these trade-offs in well-being, translate as much as possible for policy guidance, and to explore promising data sets like the SDG dashboard, the EU Silk, which I have mentioned, and also the inclusion of ONS4, so 4-point well-being questions in existing data sets. So to conclude, these were my thought starters for an agenda for future research: well-being and the environment, or well-being and environmental behavior, qualitative insights, well-being in blue spaces, well-being in extraordinary times, well-being in diverse contexts, and the potential of global metrics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, for your thoughts and for your very good presentation. I would now ask the floor. Is there any questions? Kate.
Mine was more, so I have two questions, but one is in the chat just as a throwing it out there if anybody knows about some work. But the other one I had, Marie, and it was in relation to your first point, which was on the causal impact of pro-environmental behavior or sustainable actions on well-being. I've written a bit about this. I know there's lots of fantastic, interesting correlations out there. I just wonder, could I open the floor and just ask you, have you thoughts about how we could go about that? Because of course, it's not the same thing to force people to engage in pro-environmental action as it is to observe that they do. But again, coming back to Andrew's point earlier, we don't care just about those green blobs amongst us. We want to get more people engaged. So I wonder, have you thought at all about how that causal identification could work?
One thing that I have thought about is that it's not always, so no, I'm not going to answer the methodological question, but I'm going to answer the sort of broader issue that it's not necessarily being green that's driving the action, and therefore it's not the fulfillment of one's green motives that's necessarily making people feel good about doing it. It could be the fulfillment of social motives, the fulfillment of political preferences, even the desire to feel spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Maybe what you could do, what actually a colleague of mine and I have done for Germany, or are currently doing, is we're looking at the effect of green space and lockdowns, and whether your deterioration during lockdown in life satisfaction is lower if you're located closer to a green space as opposed to not. And we do actually find that is the case. So your life satisfaction does decrease significantly less. So we do this with a difference in difference, but the effect is really large. So the problem is to make it a bit comparable or usable for normal times, I guess, because we usually do not experience lockdowns. So it's not clear how you can now, what kind of like external validity that effect then has, I think. So that's what we're struggling with at the moment. I think Andrew was next.
Hello, Marie. Thank you for the talk. I don't think I've ever been to Malta. Although you have this very intriguing title about Paradise Lost, I don't think, unless I missed it, that you actually mentioned that. And I'm wondering whether Maltese citizens think it's Paradise Lost, and indeed whether you have data that could test that.
Okay, so yes, you're right, because I was going to elaborate a little more in my conclusion, but I was running out of time. So in the interest of giving some time to questions, I stopped there. There has been quite a rapid build-up of the country, let's say that, and there are other domains where environmental quality has suffered. And there is, you mentioned Eurobarometer surveys earlier, and we do observe, from time to time, the environment concern spikes. Sometimes it takes over other concerns that would have previously occupied pole position, as a sort of litmus test of how important the environment is to the layperson. One can observe how often it is mentioned by politicians pre-elections, for example, because certainly politicians are not there to appeal to those of us who are already, green, but they are there to appeal to the voter. And so when you see that the environment starts to become the key topic of mention, featuring in billboards and so forth, you start to see, well, they must have a finger on the pulse that people are concerned about this. One thing which I'm sort of also intrigued and wish to look into is whether young children, young people who have sort of been born into a very urbanized country and very trafficky country, and one where, access to the open spaces is much more limited, have sort of a different let's say, are experiencing a different impact than those who experience the loss, such as myself or people who are older. So I think that, it would be interesting to explore what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. Sylviane?
Hi, good afternoon, Paul. Dr. Briguglio, I wanted to get your sort of opinion on something. When it comes to those who are not as environmentally cautious, as Andrew was pointing out before, do you think there's someone who we can put the blame on, maybe the government, schooling system?
So you mean sort of justifying non-environmental behavior?
Yes, for those who are not as environmentally cautious as the younger people, maybe.
One thing that we found in our studies is that people who do not trust government tend to cooperate less. So that's come out quite clearly in various studies, that the lower the trust you have for government, the less your desire to cooperate pro-environmentally. So perhaps, one would be thinking, well, we called it the over my dead body effect, over my dead body, am I going to do all this for this government?